Welcome to Grief in Media, a podcast where we laugh, cry, feel seen in our grief, and everything in between. I'm your host, Alex Piscatelli. Let's get into it. Welcome back to Grief in Media. I am so excited for today's episode. I've been listening to her audiobook and I'm so excited to talk through it. But today we are joined by founder of Pure Minds, best-selling author of Let That Shit Go, and executive grief ambassador for the Seasons Center for Grieving Children, Nina Purewal. Nina, how are you doing today?
Hi, Alex. Thank you so much for having me on the podcast. I'm super excited to be here. I love all the work you're doing, and I'm doing fab today.
Yes, that's the best. That's the best way to be any day, is doing fab.
Doing fab, but we work in grief, so it's okay to say I'm not doing okay today, but today is a good day.
Definitely. I know. I feel like I teeter really between fab and not doing well. Like those are the two really moods that I'm in.
Yeah, and with some of my grief therapy, I've had to have someone say to me, like, it's okay to say you're not okay.
Yes. No, that's so important. I feel like normalizing that too. I think I struggle sometimes, and I've been trying to do better in the past, especially couple years, of being like, no, I'm not feeling good today, just so you know, and being okay if someone else is uncomfortable with that.
Exactly. Like a lot of for the people pleasers out there who, when someone asks, how are you doing? You're like, I'm fine, I'm great, I'm good. It's really, really important to acknowledge that, your feelings. And now I'm getting a lot more comfortable because we feel like we make other people uncomfortable by saying we're not okay. But then we're sitting in our own discomfort by pretending we're okay, right? So getting really comfortable with saying like, I'm kind of having a shitty day, or like I'm doing okay, or, because it's that whole like positive vibes only, or like the toxic positivity that sometimes makes us feel like I had a therapist say to me, you don't have to always be the one that's smiling in the room. So getting comfortable with that, because grief, as you know, comes out of nowhere and sometimes, and, you could be at a party and you're triggered, or you could be at the grocery store and you see an apple and you remember the person you're passing, like all kinds of random shit. So I think it's important to like be honest with how we're feeling. Such an important part of grief.
Definitely. I agree. And it's funny that you mentioned grocery store, because I feel like that I've talked about this with someone else too. It's like the grocery store for some reason is so triggering. I don't know what it is.
I know. Like, you walk through a cereal aisle. There's just so many things, so many memories are of food, right? So I guess you're thinking of meals, or thinking of if you lost a parent when your mom used to prep this, or you lost a sibling, you used to eat the snack together. You're right. Grocery stores are triggering, but it's so random. It's like doing something practical for yourself, and like suddenly you're like about to have a meltdown in the middle of like picking your fruits. Like so just honoring that space.
Definitely. Well, first I wanted to ask you, we have a lot to talk through, but first I wanted to ask you about your personal experience with grief, however much you feel comfortable with sharing.
Yeah, I wrote it in a book, so I'm very comfortable sharing. I'm happy being fully transparent. It's not always easy being vulnerable, but I think it's so important. And if it's going to impact someone in a positive way, I think the more we share about grief and the less it's this like dark, secretive thing, the more, we're going to push through as a society and be there to support each other. So my grief journey, I've had two kind of major incidences with grief. So when I was 16, my dad was very abusive towards my mom. She was in an abusive marriage for 22 years and finally mustered up the strength to leave. But this was in the 90s, when, especially in Indian marriages, like divorce was very taboo. You just didn't leave situations, but she did it. And my dad was a narcissist, and obviously he spent his entire marriage controlling her and couldn't handle it. So 6 months after that, I lost him and my brother to a murder-suicide. So he obviously couldn't handle what was going on, but also kind of wanted this revenge on her of like, and all the detectives on the case told me as well that, his plan was to take me. And it's a longer story, which I'll save for another time, but it was a complete fluke that like, I was out of the house. So I'm just grateful every day to be alive, to be here. So that was 16. I went through a lot of survivor's guilt, a lot of PTSD, and, numbed out, actually repressed and suppressed my entire 20s, like got myself into my career, didn't really deal a lot with the grief, was so angry with my dad. And then I'd say like in my 30s is when it kind of hit me again, because I lost my mom. So I lost my mom to ALS, and that was a 2 year horrific journey. But then when I lost her, it was like, now my last family member is gone. Everything came back up. So that's when I saw a grief therapist again. And I did a few years of like work on forgiveness. Like I went on a whole forgiveness journey with my dad. But yeah, essentially, I've lost my family to, murder, to suicide, to ALS, to like, it's been rough, but I also think there's a lot of silver linings, as crazy as that sounds, in how we view life and our perspective. And I think people who have gone through the loss of someone, how precious every single day and every single minute is. And I think when you can live life from that space, it can be so incredible and inspiring, as you are.
Thank you. No, and thank you for sharing all the grief you've gone through. I think just talking about it, I think, is huge. And so thank you so much for sharing about that. One thing I wanted to ask you is you were saying that sort of you put yourself into work and you distracted yourself with work. And I was reading that you had this background in marketing and sales, and now, you're in all this incredible wellness work. What made you finally make that transition?
Yeah. So in 20, so I worked in corporate for most of my career in sales and marketing. And then in 2010, I was about 7 years into my career and I just hit a peak point of stress. I was like addicted to work. I was addicted to I'm going to age myself, a BlackBerry at the time, Crackberry. Was emailing like all hours. And I'm like, something needs to change. Like I've gone through all this trauma. Like I'm not here just to work, work, work. Like I work, work, work. I feel like there's more to life. And I'd always been passionate about spirituality, about the meaning of life. So a 1 year course came up in Northern California. So I moved to the Redwoods and I lived in an ashram, or like a monastery, for a year. And that was life changing. And I realized we had teachers from all around the world, like monks. We had, class 7 days a week. It was super intense. But I came out of that saying, there's so much about ancient wisdom that we can apply to wellness, to corporate stress and anxiety. So I came back, that was 2011. And that's when I knew inherently I had to be in this space, but the world wasn't ready. Like no one was talking about mindfulness or wellness or mental health in the workspace. So I worked in startup for a while. And then 2017 is when I jumped in. I finally said, okay, let me just try this. I had 2 clients. And I gave myself a year. I said I can always fall back into corporate. And here we are 7 years and 60 clients later. But to answer the real question is like, it was just an inherent knowing that, I love sales and marketing. I got to do some really cool things, work on some great brands, build them. But my core of who I was, what I want to achieve is to help people find hope through adversity. And I just knew, I didn't know how it was going to manifest. And sometimes when you want to do the thing, it's not about figuring out exactly what it looks like. It's just knowing what the thing is and then letting that manifest for itself.
Definitely. That's so amazing. And especially being able to help people when that's something that is so core to who you are, I think is so, so important. One thing I wanted to ask is what is it about mindfulness and meditation that helps and intersects with grief? Like, is it something that grievers often turn to? How can it help grievers? I would love to hear more about that.
Yeah, I love that question. For me, it's saved my life. I've been in therapy since I was 16, so I'm not negating. I think that's so important to get the help that you need. I had grief counselors, I had peer-to-peer support, I had, trauma therapy, grief therapy, like all of it. So I think that's important. But for me, meditation and mindfulness has been a complete game changer. I've been meditating for like 18 years now, and I've been in this space, for 25 years. I've kind of parallel pathed it. But it's a little tricky with grief because I think it's really important when the heavy trauma stuff comes out. You can't meditate your way through that. You need to actually have the tools. So I don't want to negate, the importance of having the right tools to go through things. But mindfulness and meditation is all about awareness of the mind. So if we can be more aware, we think on average 60,000 thoughts a day, and 80% of them are self-deprecating. And if we've gone through trauma, you can only imagine how that's compounded. So the first chapter of our book is, awareness of the mind. So with meditation, it's like going to the gym for your mind. You're actually sitting there with just you and your mind. With mindfulness, it's in the everyday. And so you can have little tools like, let's say the grocery store, for example. If you're not living on autopilot or subconsciously, you're tuned in to what's going on. So you pick up the cereal box that reminds you of your sibling or your parent that used to, and instead of just, I mean, this is why I want to be careful, because there's space for feeling what comes up, but sometimes you can just be like, okay, this is my grief. I'm going to hold space for it for a second. This is coming up. I'm going to take a few deep breaths, which is also ties into mindfulness and meditation, send them some love or give myself, and then off we go. Versus like someone said to me once, one of my mentors, once you get into the fifth or sixth thought about something, you can really go down the rabbit hole. So I think what it prevents, without negating the work that needs to be done, is like all these little moments where you're just going down the rabbit hole, and like an hour later you can't come out of it because of that cereal box. You know what I mean? You can't enjoy life. You're so defined by your grief. You're so, and again, sometimes we go through phases like that, but I think it's those little moments where we can be like, okay, they wouldn't want us to sit here and think about the cereal box. They would want us to like call the friend and maybe have a little cry and then move forward, right? So just, it helps with the awareness. It helps with, in meditation, understanding what those thoughts are, right? Because sometimes it's grief, but we don't know. Is it denial? Is it anger? Is it sadness? Is it a crime scene? Is it seeing a parent like slowly fade away? Like, it makes you aware of what it is that's contributing, and then once you're aware of what it is, you can do the more specific work to mitigate the grief.
Definitely. When you're sort of at the grocery store and you think of, your mom's reaction to what she would say if I'm feeling sad, is that part of mindfulness? Because you're sort of in the moment and thinking of, or because I'm always like hung up on that because I'm really bad at being mindful. So I've been learning a lot from your book. Can that be mindfulness too?
Yeah, mindfulness is just about being present, and it's about being present with your thoughts and emotions too. And sometimes mindfulness for me is I'm triggered by grief and I'm sitting there, and the mindfulness is I'm feeling really sad right now and I can't stop thinking about my mom, and I'm just going to sit in it. And sometimes when we sit in it and give us that is mindful too. I'm so glad you asked that question, because compartmentalizing, making space for that can help us sometimes move through it faster. Because I realized in my 20s, I did a whole shitload of like, nope, let me get my laptop out. I'm not going to do this. Can't go there. Da, da, da. And sometimes with trauma, that is the case. It takes some time. But my trauma healing around the crime scene was 25 years later, so, but to your point, like, I think being present with your grief it really empowers you with it, because it gives yourself the permission to like, I can feel sad. I can feel angry right now. I can feel mad at the world and sit in it. And then when you sit in it, you can lift it up and you can move through it, versus like repress and suppress. So I think it is absolutely mindful. Mindfulness is all about just being exactly where you are. So if you're having a thought of your mom and you pull out at the grocery store, have that moment. But then also when you're in the next moment of hanging out with friends, then you compartmentalize that, and be present with that.
I know that mindfulness really is sort of, it's not something it's something you practice, but it's not something you go to therapy for example. For people who have newly experienced grief, do you think mindfulness is something you can work on right away? Like, is it something you should like wait on? I'm always curious about that, because I know we talk about that for different types of therapy as well.
Yeah, I believe it's beneficial like at any time. And I think with mindfulness, it is about, so many times we're physically somewhere, but we're like mentally somewhere else. And again, with grief, it's a little tough, but like mindfulness is really about being present. And like, so, I had a teacher when I came back from California and I was back in the real world, and I was like mortgage and all the stress. And I said, it's one thing when you're walking the redwoods to be mindful. Like, I'm in the real world now. Like, how do I be mindful? And he said, just start speaking out loud what you're doing. So he said, let's say you're doing the dishes. Your dialogue will sound something like this. Now I'm putting soap on the sponge. Now I'm making circular motions on this pot. Now I'm rinsing this pot. Now I'm putting it on the drying rack. I know it sounds, but it teaches you how to be, because so often we're cooking but our mind is like somewhere else. We're in a meeting. We're with friends. Like, our mind so much. Social media and phones don't help with all of this. But I definitely think it helps, because it keeps you in the moment. It keeps you honest with your feelings. And a lot of the time, subconsciously, we just end up going to grief, just because it's such a big part of our brains now and our functioning now. So the more you can be mindful in the little things you do, you might not give it as much space. But again, I say that very cautiously with grief, because I think it's important to acknowledge the emotion and let it come in as well.
Definitely. I love the saying out loud trick. I'm going to start using that because that makes so much sense. It's like when it's funny you mentioned social media and phones because I spend way too much time on my phone. And I think if I was like, okay, I'm going to get up now and go wash the dishes or whatever it may be, I think that would be really helpful in being so present in what I'm doing.
Yeah. And you can do this anytime. This is why I love mindfulness, because you don't need anything for it. So even when you're in the shower, let's say like the grief is coming up and it's kind of low key grief, like you're not having a full on breakdown, you can just start being like, okay, now I'm soaping my arm. Now I'm like soaping my legs. Now I'm putting shampoo in and the mind will run off like in 15 minutes of doing the dishes. It will run off like 30, 40 times because that's the job. That's what our mind does, but we bring it back. Right. And we bring it back and we bring it back and we build that muscle and that strength. And again, that gives us more space to be in the here and now versus like all the places we could go to. And usually all those places are negative spaces, stress inducing spaces.
We've mentioned your book, Let That Shit Go, a few times, and I really want to dive into it. What made you write it? Had you always wanted to write a book, and how did this come to you?
Nope. This is so crazy because I get this question. I had no intentions to write a book. I'm a numbers math person. After my dad and brother died, I failed English. I had to, like, I always tell high school students, I'm like, I'm a best-selling author who somehow, feel like never give up kind of thing. But no, I had no intentions to write a book. Kate, my co-author, and I, we were doing workshops in Toronto on mindfulness and learn how to meditate, mindful AF. This is when like the AF thing was like big, and they went viral. And then our publisher, HarperCollins, they wanted to write a mindfulness version of The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck. And so they caught wind of our workshops and they actually approached us and asked us to write this book, which is like absolutely incredible. And it's just a nod to sometimes when you follow your path, when you do what you're meant to do, when you do what you're put on earth, because I think some of us are, a lot of people, especially in the corporate space, I have to say, golden handcuffs, would love to be an artist, but can't do, and there's other ways to make that practical. But when you start to embody and do what you're meant to do, the universe like supports you in a way. And this is just one thing. Don't get me wrong, I've had to work my ass off as an entrepreneur, but this is one thing that completely fell in my lap. So no intentions, and now I'm so grateful for it, honestly. But yeah, it's just one of those things. It's just I followed my path, and the universe was like, "Here you go. Here's what you're meant to do right now."
Definitely. What was it like to sort of put it all together, in written words in this book? Was it hard to do? Did it come so naturally? What was that process like?
Such a great question, and it's so interesting because I thought it would be a lot harder, but. And I'm going to say this because it's a grief podcast, is I wasn't a writer. My mom was. My mom was a beautiful writer, poet. She has books out. And so when I started, we had 9 weeks to write the book. It was this crazy rush timeline. We had to hand in a chapter a week. And so I was like, I have no time to like overthink, which I also think if you're writing a book, that's a good parameter, is like you end up overthinking. So just like write what comes naturally. So I had this candle from my mom's funeral. And I lit it the first time. It was this big fat orange candle. The first time I wrote down, I just lit the candle. I said, okay, Mom, like use me as a vessel, like work through me. I don't know where to start with this. And stuff was just flowing out of me to the point where I'd read it after and be like, did I even write that? Like it was crazy. And sometimes when we kind of detach from our ego and we get out of our own head, like it gets rid of the imposter syndrome and you're like, okay, let's just come through me. And I'll just finish the story by saying, every time I sat down to write, I would light that candle and I would, think of my mom and kind of channel her. And I was writing the very last paragraph, like 9 weeks later, finishing the book, writing the last paragraph, and the candle went out.
Oh my gosh.
It was incredible. So that whole process, I'm super grateful for. It was such a personal thing. I feel like it was really healing. Kate and I always say it was a love letter to ourselves. And there's still things, it's been out for 5 years, but there's still tips, because it's 120 tips that I am still learning, how to implement. So it was like everything was in my head, but it's almost like, okay, now that it's all there, now the pressure's on to actually adhere to like everything you're telling everyone else in the world to do. So, especially the self-love and the authenticity chapters have been huge for me in the last couple of years. So yeah, it was a beautiful process. I'm super grateful for it. And I kind of just detached a little bit and just tuned in and said, like, there's a Mother Teresa quote. It's call it cheesy or whatever, but I'm a pencil in the hands of God writing his story, whether you believe in God, universe, or whatever. But I just kind of like really hung on to that of like, okay, this is what I meant to do. I didn't have intentions to write a book, but this is what the universe wants. So we're going to go and like, just help me with it. So here we are.
Oh, that's so beautiful. I absolutely love to hear that. What is your what tip? I'd love to hear your favorite tip from the book, and then I'd love to hear the one that you find people often, tell you about or resonate with. What one stands out for a lot of people?
Oh my gosh, that's such a good question. I would say the first chapter is all about awareness. And I'd say that the moment where we talk about how happiness, your true nature is happiness. It's joy, it's bliss. This is what ancient Buddhism even talks about, is that we were inherently born happy. If you look at toddlers, like they see a fire hydrant or a cloud, and then over time, all the emotional stuff as a child or a tween or a teen, a bad coach or a mean teacher or parents like making us feel not good, and all the stuff comes on. So when people say, "Oh, I'm on a journey to find happiness," I always say, it's already there. There's no like the journey is letting go of all of the shit in the way. So I think that, I think 5 pages in or so, we talk about, how your true nature is happiness. And it's a kind of a big aha moment for people that, oh, the work I have to do is to get rid of all the things that are not serving me. And then we'll reveal the true self in us. It's just, we can't see it because I always use this analogy of like when it's raining or it's cloudy or dreary outside and there's clouds everywhere and you have no access to the sun hasn't gone anywhere. The sun is still there. So just like that, our true nature it's always going to be like happiness, but we just have so much shit in the way. And then I would say in recent years, I'm just going to refer to chapters instead of tips, but the self-love chapter, especially for people who identify as women, and the authenticity chapter, work-wise, I'm getting so many requests on like women empowerment workshops, which is basically the authenticity chapter, have been very like predominant and helpful for people, I would say.
I have to tell you, I loved the self-love chapter, especially because I find it's funny because I've always like, I don't know, like I love myself, I respect myself, all of those things, but especially in the past couple of years, I put so much pressure on myself. And it really the one thing that made me realize how much pressure I put on myself is a few months ago, me and my husband were sitting there and I was saying like, oh, I feel like I should be doing more. I feel like blah, 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 blah. And we joke about our cat. He was like, oh, well, look at Dory. She's not doing anything. And I was like, don't say that about her. Like, that's so mean. And he was like, but you say that about yourself. What do you mean? And now look what you're saying. You're defending her, but you're not defending yourself.
Wow.
I'm like, a light bulb just went off. And I'm like, I've never thought about it like that. And since then I've tried to be really active about how I'm talking to myself. But I loved the self-love chapter because I agree. I think it's something that so many people can resonate with.
I'm so happy to hear that. And that is the self-love chapter will go through the process of like how to navigate imposter syndrome. Because, our internal dialogue, it's horrible. And like when I do imposter syndrome workshops, the way we start is I have people write down like, what are your most self-deprecating thoughts? And it's like, I'm not good enough. I don't deserve this relationship. Like, I'm an idiot. I'm overweight. Da, 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 da. And, before we get into like how we mitigate those thoughts and move through them, my second slide is like, okay, picture the people who unconditionally love you. If you give them this list, are they going to be like, oh yeah, that's Alex to a T for sure? No, it's only us that sees ourselves through such a negative lens. And again, I think this is worse for people who identify as women. Like we're always holding ourselves to this ridiculous standard, right? And so if we start just seeing ourselves through like how the world sees you, and I have to say, if you've gone through grief, giving yourself the permission to know that that has affected your brain, and you might not be operating as effectively or as efficiently as your coworkers or your peers who haven't gone through this loss. And it took me 20 years to realize when I lost my dad and brother, no one was talking about PTSD or trauma or mental health. And it took me so long to realize like why I went to university, and I'd sit through lecture and I'd leave and I'd be like, I have no idea what they just talked about. So on top of the self-love, I think if you're a trauma or grief, survivor, it's important to give yourself permission to like not be firing on all cylinders all the time. Because I put that pressure on myself, and now I look back and think I didn't need to. And a lot of people, it's like there's a book by Oprah, and I'm not going to remember the other author's name at the moment, but it's called What Happened to You. And it's if you're into science and stuff, it just talks about what happens to the brain when you've gone through loss or trauma. And it was so enlightening to be like, we push ourselves to these standards, but like we can't compare ourselves to people who have not gone through these events.
Right, definitely. One question I just thought of as you were saying that is, how do you think as in our interpersonal relationships in media, in talking to the people around us, do you think we talk about grief differently than we did, 10, 20 years ago? Do you think it's a different landscape now? I'm just curious as you were talking about that.
Definitely 100%. It's a different landscape. Like, it was 1997 when I went through, and I feel like I walked the high schools with like, it said it on my forehead, like the murder suicide girl, but no one actually really talked to me or knew what to say. So I think now, and I'll put it in I'll couple it with like the whole mental health umbrella, that people are a lot more open. People, when I went to work, like nobody knew. No, people I worked with 20 years ago are now finding out what I went through just a few years prior, because I just didn't feel like it was a safe space to talk about it. So I feel like with mental health being what it is, it's made an impact, but I still think there's so much room and space for understanding grief, for talking about grief, for holding space for it, to know how to support people, and trauma. We don't talk about either of those as much, and the impact it has on how you're showing up. So that's why I love what you're doing, because I don't think there's enough people who really understand how to work through grief.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I wanted to ask too, what has it been like for you since Let That Shit Go came out? Now it's been, I believe, 5 years. I saw it was 2019.
Yeah.
What has it been like in those 5 years since?
I'll say I'll go back to 2 years prior and say, what has it been like since you've followed this path that I've been, since I founded Pure Minds? And yeah, in the book, it's been absolutely incredible. I'm so grateful every single day that I get to do what I love, that I get to, share my story. And hopefully, I always said when the book came out, as long as one person is impacted, maybe one person decides I'm not going to take my life today, or I'm not going to, I'm going to love myself more, that it's all worth it. And it's been absolutely incredible. The success of the book has shocked Kate and I, because we are Canadian and got rejected by 18 US publishers. HarperCollins Canada got us, and we actually were all around the world, but we could not penetrate the US market. And then a few years ago, we partnered with a really small publisher, and it's been in the top 20 self-help at Barnes & Noble. It just made an Amazon bestseller list because of this famous singer has been posting about it. The longevity of the book has been an absolute shocker, because, we were told it'll peak and then plateau for about 6 months. And that's kind of the life cycle of a book. So to be here 5 years later and it's still hitting bestseller lists, and it just feels absolutely amazing. And I'm super grateful for it. So how life has changed is, I feel like I'm living the authenticity chapter that we wrote. And I get to do what I love. I don't feel like I work a single day, since the book came out and since I've founded my business, and the healing, and I'm still on a healing journey. 2.5 years ago, I did 20 weeks of trauma healing around the crime scene. So it's a journey, but just incredibly grateful. And the most fulfilling thing to me is, yes, I need money to put food on the table. That's nice. But when people write me, or they come up to me, or they DM me, and they're like, oh my gosh, this had this impact. And it's like, I just so fulfilled by that.
I wanted to ask you about Season Center for Grieving Children. Can you tell me about your work with them?
Yes. So the Season Center for Grieving Children was founded by a man named Rolly in 2000, or sorry, in 1996, because he lost his daughters in a car accident, and he wanted to provide space for peer-to-peer support group. So when incident happened with my dad and brother in 97, I actually went to the Season Center, and I think it's what kept me alive. It was the first time I felt seen and heard. And it's because I was around other peers who had gone through really traumatic losses as a teenager. Because in high school, I felt like, even though I had so many friends and such a great supportive network and my mom, and I just felt like nobody really understood what I was going through. And to your point, back, no one really knew what to say. So the Season Center provided such a safe space of like, I'm not this like weirdo kid who's gone through this and I'm alone. Like I finally, as I said, felt really seen and heard. So now, all these 25 years later, I'm an executive grief ambassador for them and help get the word out of what they do and with funding and fundraising. But essentially, it's peer-to-peer support for teens and kids. And there has been so many kids since the pandemic who've lost their parents to addiction or suicide. In Canada, depression's on the rise, anxiety is on the rise, suicide rates for youth have doubled. So they're an organization where, it's not therapy, but it's peer-to-peer support. So you're with other kids who have also lost their mom or their dad. And it's a really safe space. Like for the younger kids, there's like rooms with where you can literally bounce off the walls. They have like mats all around the walls, or you can, there's just ways, like outlets, for kids. But I think the most important thing is kids feeling like, because you go to school and it's like, let's do a craft for Mother's Day, or let's do a craft for, and it's like, not every kid isn't. So they're constantly feeling, or they see they're constantly triggered, right? They see young kids with their parents picking them up from school and all they have is their grandparents, or, so it just makes you feel like you're not the only one. They're a fantastic organization. So anyone who wants to volunteer or fund or talk to companies about, sponsoring them, like, please get the word out. They're Season Center for Grieving Children. It's a fantastic organization. They saved me. Like I can say I had so many realizations going to the Season Center. Yeah.
That's so amazing. Now as an adult, I'm in a support group for people who have lost both parents. And I'm like, if I knew anything, I wish I knew about support groups when I was 17 and lost my dad, because I think that would have been so huge. Just being around, like you said, people who understand and can relate to you, I think is so, so huge for people who grief makes you feel so alone. So I think having community is so huge.
It's very isolating. And like the nuances of grief and trauma, like you can only, like, unless you've gone through it. And I would love to know the support group you go through for people who have lost parents, because I've noticed in my inner circle, there's 3 people in my inner circle who have lost both their parents. And that's why they're in my inner circle, because they get that part of me that, and I have so many compassionate friends, and, it's not to say they don't try to understand, but there's just an inherent understanding when you've gone through it of like the little nuances of, what you're missing.
Definitely. No, I agree. The group I go through is through the dinner party. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that org, but I absolutely love them. I sing their praises all the time. They're doing wonderful work in the grief space.
I love it. I'm going to totally check them out. I think that's great. I think it's so important because grief it's very isolating. It's very daunting. And then when you feel alone, it just perpetuates that feeling. So that's great. I love that there are these organizations that give people support they need.
Definitely. One more question I wanted to ask you. On Grief and Media, we love to talk about the different media that is represented, great like grief experiences and that people can relate to, and that talks about grief in a really wonderful lens. What pieces of media have you found helpful in processing your grief?
That's such a great question. Movies and shows, I would say media is really interesting because I think it can have both a negative and positive impact on grief. Like for me, I had to be really careful with like violence because the way my dad and brother died was very violent, and I saw the crime scene, and any type of those scenes would be hugely triggering. So I'd say with media, sometimes the most helpful thing to do is to know what triggers you and to avoid that. Like if you've lost your mom, then maybe don't watch a show or a movie that's all about the bonding of a mother and daughter, or, unless you're in a different place with it. So that's the watch out for media. But I find media can be so helpful in terms of understanding, helping you understand grief. So things like watching, like Tyler Henry and The Medium, like how to connect with people you've lost, or like, I think I'm trying to remember that movie. It was Reese Witherspoon. I think it was called Wild.
Oh, is it the Cheryl oh, what's her name? Was it based on the book?
Yes, it was based on the book.
Yes, I know what you're talking about, but I can't think of her
I
name.
meant to Google it before this interview, but I think it has the word wild in it. But I found that movie was such an amazing depiction of grief, because she would have those moments where she would be, walking in the wild, and she would see, let's say, I'm making this up, but she would see like a waterfall. And then suddenly it's like, you think you're having this great moment and beautiful day and da da da. And suddenly you see something, and it's like, you go back to this childhood moment where you're sitting there with your mom watching a waterfall. I think that's one of the most misunderstood things, like how easily grief can just like pop up. I think This Is Us, the show This Is Us, is also a fantastic show around, the depiction of grief and the little innuendos or little intricacies that happen of like how you end up living the rest of your life, right? Like one little thing can be like, okay, now I never want a dog again because dad, in that show, it's like he went in to save the dog, and then, sorry, spoiler alert. But there's so many good shows out there now. I find that, the Netflix or the streaming shows that are really, really helpful in making you feel less isolated, that like, oh my gosh, like I remember even watching This Is Us. I'm like, oh my gosh, it's not just me that like this happened to, and I had this irrational fear of blah, 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 So I think leaning into shows that, can kind of hear you and see you and hold space, and also avoiding trigger inducing things as well.
You're the second person to mention This Is Us, and my mom used to watch it when it was airing, and I'm like, maybe I should give it a try now.
Honestly, that's so I love that. And yeah, maybe she's trying to tell you. I always feel like they deliver. I don't know if you believe in angels and signs and all. I think signs are
definitely
huge. I love signs. I feel like they make you feel like they're still with you, because it's just their body that's gone, right? Like you can't see our thoughts, you can't see our emotions, you can't see our connections. Like you can just see what's physical, and that's what's gone from them. Everything else, they're still their essence, their spirit. So I feel like she's trying to tell you. She's like, Alex, watch.
Exactly. No, I think so too. I love what you said. I definitely believe in signs, and I love that there's a poem that was in like a hospice book that we got when my mom passed away. But it was something I'll have to put it in the show notes. I can't remember the exact the name of the poet, but it says something like, just because the boat is gone doesn't mean their impacts are just as, like, their impacts in the waves they create are just as vast, just because we can't see the boat here on our land or whatever. And so I think that's huge. And I love that you said that. I'm like, maybe this is a sign.
Yeah, definitely. I love that. I think that's so beautiful. And I think that show would really resonate with you, because they lose their dad as teenagers.
Yeah, definitely.
At 16 or 17 or something. So I really resonated, because I lost my dad at the same time, and there was a house fire, and they died in a house fire. So I think, maybe your mom was like, this will, and just a lot around grief in that show and how it transpires. But I love that. And I do think believing that they're here in some form is such a big part of the healing process, if you can get yourself there. And when the signs come in, being like unequivocal about the fact that like, that's them. Like, and sometimes they're so specific, right? Like they're numbers, or they're like, you can't deny, like it's got, like you walk in or you turn on the radio and their favorite song comes on, which is like, when that happens with my brother, it's like, it's 97. Like you don't hear, his favorite band was No Doubt and Gwen Stefani. And so every time I hear, I'm like, okay, that's got to be you saying hi, and it always happens to be when you need them, so tuning into that, I think, can be so, so powerful in your grief process.
Well, thank you so much, Nina. It has been so wonderful to have you here. Is there anything else you want to share about Pure Minds, about Let That Shit Go, about Season Center? Is there anything else you want to share?
I would just share that there's hope. I just want to give that overall message that you might be in a really dark place right now. You might feel like you're getting emotional, that you can't go on. That life is never and it is never the same again. I'm not going to sugarcoat that. It's different. You learn to live with a new normal, but you can find what you love. You can embrace, a path that is super fulfilling. You can be happy again. You can feel joy. Like all of that is there waiting for you. There's sadness through, but I just want to let people know, like, it's not the end. There's so much still to discover and unravel about life.
Definitely. Thank you so much. I feel like you're saying that straight to me. So thank you so much for that. Where can people find your work?
So you can, my website is ninapurewal.com. So you can find the book, links to the book on Amazon or Barnes and Noble there. You can find the book in store, pretty much every major bookstore. And in terms of the corporate workshops, so if you're interested in a corporate workshop, just check out the website. I'm on Instagram, but I've been on a year hiatus, so I still check it, but I still check my DMs here and there, or you can email me. And I'm also on LinkedIn, so you can connect with me there too.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Great. Thanks, Alex. Thanks for having me on. I so appreciate it. I loved our conversation.
Thank you so much for listening to Grief in Media. If you liked this episode, please rate and review. Check out our media database, newsletter, essays, and more at griefinmedia.com. And don't forget to follow us on Instagram at griefinmedia. Okay, thank you so much for listening. Love you all. I'll see you next time.